Hi, this is Larry Jordan, and welcome to this Final Cut Pro 10 training. This session covers workflow. Why even have a workflow? Well, the short answer is that a workflow keeps you organized and minimizes distractions. When you think about it, a hobby is a task you do for the fun of it, because you enjoy the process of the hobby. But a profession is a task you do to pay the rent, and, ideally, because you also enjoy the process. When you're working on your hobby, you really never have to complete anything. But when you're doing it as a profession, you have to complete projects, otherwise you won't get paid. Which means that workflows mean money. As editors, all we have to sell is our time and our creativity. The more efficient we are with our time, the more projects we can tackle and the more money we can make. Or, putting it another way, wasting time costs us money. So having a workflow that works answers the key question, what should I be doing right now to be as efficient as possible? And so I've created a 12-step workflow process that divides to two big chunks. The first chunk of 6 steps is create your story. The second chunk is polishing your story. When we're creating our story, the first thing we want to do is to plan what we want to do. Then we get organized, ideally before we start. Then gather our media all into one spot, build our story in the timeline, organize our story, and trim our story. Once we've got the story part done, now we get to polish it. We add transitions, add text and effects, polish the audio, which we call audio repair and mixing, adjust the color, which we call color correction and grading, and then export or share your finished project. And then, most importantly, you need to archive your project, because you don't want to have it cluttering up your system forever and ever. So we got to figure out a way to store it for the long term. Well, let's take a closer look at these 12 workflow steps, because all the rest of my training follows this process. Now, this workflow session is just an overview, because we're going to go into lots and lots of detail throughout this training, and you can refer to the individual chapters for more specific information. Step 1 is to plan, and when I tell this to young editors, their faces fall, because the very first thing they want to do is they want to get in and they want to start cutting and they want to... Wrong! You got to think about the story you want to tell first. What do you need to know to be able to tell your story? Who's your audience? What does your audience expect? Who needs to see and approve your project? What media or other files do you need? What do you have to shoot? What are you going to buy? What are you going to create? What video format do you need to deliver? What's your deadline? What's your budget? Taking a deep breath at the very beginning and thinking through your whole process will make your life a whole lot easier, because you'll discover it's much simpler to solve a problem before you get into the problem than to solve a problem after it's suddenly nipping at your heels. The second step is to get organized. Here you want to copy the files from any card or external device to a locally attached hard drive or RAID. And remember, always create backups. In Final Cut Pro 10, media can be stored either on a local hard disk or a network server. However, project files can only be stored on a locally attached drive, whether that's a single drive, an internal drive, external drive, or RAID. It has to be locally attached to your computer. You can organize your files in the Finder, but Final Cut Pro 10 is constructed to make it easier to organize your files in the event library inside Final Cut, because, by default, Final Cut copies media from wherever it is into the event folder for editing. Then you create a new event. Then you create a new project. Now you're organized. Step 3 is to gather your media. Ingest, which means bring in. Ingest your media directly from your camera, or you can ingest from a folder on your hard drive, or from an attached media device like a card reader or a camera. My strong recommendation is that you want to copy your media to your hard drive before you ingest. Final Cut Pro 10 does not support capture using timecode from tape. It only supports video streamed in from tape. Basically, you push the play button on your tape deck, and Final Cut captures whatever flows in. Now there's a workaround here, and that's that you can capture your media from timecode-based tape using Final Cut 7, store that as a QuickTime file, then import the QuickTime file into Final Cut Pro 10. We'll talk more about this in the chapter on ingesting. Then you add keywords, what we call metadata or tagging. You want to add keywords to your clips, which makes them easier to find later. The fourth step is to build your story. And I remember the very first time I had an editing project, I could just imagine how perfect it was going to be. Beautiful photography, perfectly focused, great actors, and then the clips showed up. And it was a train wreck. What we imagine is always different than the reality. So rather than get hung up on trying to make it perfect right at the very beginning, let's just get it down to the timeline so we can see what we've got to work with. So let's preview our clips, decide what shot we want to use, select a range or mark the in and the out, edit it to the timeline, and then repeat over and over and over until your story's done. And don't be too fussy at this point. The goal is to quickly create a rough idea of your story, then refine it until you run out of time, because you'll always run out of time on your project because there's always ways you can make it better. Once you've got your story built, then you organize it. Where does your story actually begin? You want to shuffle the clips around until things start to make sense. Delete the clips you don't need. Add clips you need to add. Keep removing the material that you don't want until you get down to the key elements of your story. The process of editing is the process of organization and removal of pieces of your story that don't really belong there. Then you want to trim your story. Trimming is the process of adjusting where two clips touch. Trimming makes the difference between an amateur movie and a professional one. When you're looking at photographs of your family, you generally don't want to edit them because you love them too much. You just want to take a look at them and say, wow, I remember that day, and oh, look how small they used to be. But for the rest of us that don't know your family and don't have that backstory, it's just about the most mind-numbing thing you can ask anybody to do is to watch home movies because they weren't involved. They don't have that same interest. So what trimming allows us to do is to adjust where two clips touch to get rid of the stuff that isn't necessary. It's called adjusting the continuity between two shots so they flow so seamlessly the transition from one shot to the next doesn't even look edited, which frankly drives me completely nuts. I will spend a half an hour making the perfect edit point between two shots, and it looks so good that it just flows smoothly by, and people say, so what did you do? All that work. And no one notices. Once we got those first 6 steps done, that's the creation of the story part and the storytelling. Now we're into polishing, which is principally effects. Step 7 is to add transitions. And there's 3 types of transitions we can add. We can add cuts, dissolves, or wipes. You use cuts the most, dissolve second most, and wipes only when you're forced. Because wipes are most cool when they're rarely used. And don't spend time adding transitions until you got the order of your shots pretty much figured out, because you and I both know what's going to happen. You're going to add this really cool transition, and you're going to spend 5 or 10 minutes tweaking it and making it exactly right and adding the color and having it go the right speed. And all of a sudden you realize the first shot's not necessary. You delete the first shot, and you've wasted 10 minutes putting a transition in. You want to add transitions after your shots are pretty much in the order that you want. Then, and this one is the one that takes as much time as you've got, you add text and effects. Effects will soak up every available minute of your time because you can tweak them forever. So don't start adding effects until you've got your story complete, because there's nothing worse than having great effects and no story. Just as there's 3 different types of transitions, there are also 3 different types of effects. There are text effects, motion effects, and filter effects. And this training will show you all of them. The next step after you've added effects is to polish your audio. Now, we don't really call it polishing audio. We call it audio mixing, but I'm trying to come up with something that makes sense with this polish analogy we've got going on here. So when the story is complete and your effects are done, That's the time to finish your audio. Don't get too hung up adjusting audio until you've got all your shots in the right order. Don't get hung up on working on audio till you got everything trimmed and it's nice and tight, because otherwise you spend time adjusting audio, then you move a shot and your audio's screwed up. You fix the audio, you move a shot, the audio's screwed up, and you're in this endless loop of chasing your tail. The general rule of thumb is you do your final audio mix after all of your editing is done, after all of your trimming is done, and after most of your effects are done. And the process of polishing your audio is doing things like adding sound effects, adding music, and then setting audio levels. By the way, here's an important tip. You want to make sure that your audio levels never, ever exceed 0 dB, because if they do, your audio is going to sound terrible. It's such an important rule. We'll repeat it several times during this training. Final Cut Pro can create both stereo and 5.1 surround audio mixes, so you got plenty of things to experiment with to make your project sound great. Step 10 is to create that final color look. When everything else is done, you create the final look for your project by adjusting the color of your clips. Now, this final color step has two parts. First is correcting for color problems. Overexposure, underexposure, camera not white balance, that kind of thing. And the second is to create a color grade or color look. Final Cut Pro 10 can do both. Second last step is to export, what Apple calls sharing your project. To create your finished project, you share it or you export it. Now, share both outputs your project and compresses it for a wide variety of services. Sharing is fast and easy and works with existing presets. Export creates a master file of your project, which you can then compress later. Now, my personal recommendation is to export, but export does create a two-step process. If you're in a hurry or just confused on what to do, share is no question. It's faster and easier. Just as a note, Final Cut Pro 10 does not support output to tape, just output to file. The last step on any project is to archive it. Archiving is the process of collecting all your assets and preserving them for the long term. Final Cut Pro 10 makes the process of collecting assets for final archiving easy. How you decide to archive them is up to you, though my current recommendation is LTO5 tape. It's a bit more expensive, but it's a lot more secure, because I am not a fan of long-term storage using hard disks stored on a shelf. The whole reason behind creating a workflow is that it helps us to be both creative and efficient by focusing on the task we need to do right now. It helps us to minimize spinning our wheels. And the rest of this training on Final Cut Pro 10 is designed to follow this same workflow, except to provide a whole lot more detail. Because when you've got yourself organized with a workflow, it allows you to focus on storytelling. And then Final Cut Pro 10 will watch over the technical issues of editing your video. My name is Larry Jordan. Thanks for watching.